Good morning, everyone. My name is Peter Fish. I'm here to tell you a little bit about Mendelian and our mission to accelerate the diagnosis of rare diseases. In the rare disease community, you'll often hear very common stories. Patients that have symptoms and have these for long times, they have gone long distances to see specialists. They have had misdiagnoses and had treatments that they do not need. And ultimately, a lot of these times, they think that these things are in their heads, and ultimately, eventually, they get diagnosed. At the moment, currently, there are over 7,000 known rare diseases. This together has affected an estimated 350 million people around the world. An accurate diagnosis is essential to be put forward and to access treatment, clinical trials, and support communities. At its core, diagnosing rare diseases is an information challenge. It's a matching challenge. Symptoms are often multisystemic. They emerge and set in gradually over time. Phenotypes differ in different ages and in different ethnic backgrounds. In a world where healthcare settings are overstretched and knowledge grows daily, technology has to play a role. Mendelscan is a software as a medical device which is solving this problem. It uses AI to interrogate electronic health records to identify patients who may have undiagnosed and unsuspected rare diseases. In our early validation studies, we found a cohort of patients that could have been identified 4.5 years earlier with Mendelscan. At the moment, we have a clinical trial in the NHS where we're looking at a population of 1.5 million patients. We are applying and processing billions of clinical records and clinical events to identify one of 40 of the hardest to diagnose rare diseases. Our early results indicate that these very difficult to spot clinical patterns are being picked up in about 1 in 1,000 patients. And these rates are even higher in areas of high deprivation, showing and indicating that potentially this technology could have a very positive impact on health equity, finding patients and reaching patients that have never been reached before. When we put forward patients to clinicians, we get feedback that around 2/3 of these patients are seen as high value to review, and about 50% of these patients are now moving forward on some diagnostic pathway. The Horizon Prize is a very exciting opportunity for us to accelerate our work. If we select it, we'll use the funding to prepare our technology to be used and deployed outside of the UK so we can continue to find patients regardless of setting of care. So on behalf of the small but expert and relentless team at Mendelian, we thank you very much for your time, and we're very happy and excited to share our work with you and grateful for your support. Thank you very much.
All right, judge questions. Edda?
Yeah. Thank you very much, and congratulations for making it this far. My question would be on your study. How wide is your racial diversity, and what kind of observations have you come across? As you've mentioned that sometimes the presentations could be different.
So there are a few ways to answer that. A lot of our initial algorithms are built from literature studies and in consultation with key opinion leaders. So we do engage specifically on understanding how the ethnic backgrounds might impact that. That's the first piece. A lot of our training data, we have access to around 23 million patients, anonymized patient records that we train on. We don't often have very clear indication of ethnic background. We do occasionally, and we look at that. But what we do have in that data is what the NHS in the UK uses as a deprivation index. So we have an idea of how deprived historically these different segments are. So that's the current level of data that we're working at. And the information, as I say, has been that we're starting to see that we find more patients in these higher deprivation index areas. So that's the start of it. But I think we have a long way to go to understand exactly how this is going to work. And of course, with AI, you always have that risk of being in a situation where you're over-indexing for patients that you have in your data sets instead of the minority group. So it's very much a focus for us. We have a very dedicated piece of work that we're taking forward in the next year to have a look even more deeply at that.
Vikram.
So just thinking along the lines of electronic health records, how sophisticated or how structured do the records have to be in order for your solution to work. So you can imagine in multiple countries around the world, the level of specificity, the availability of information may not be as structured as in other markets.
Correct, and even to the extent that in some hyperlocal situations we see less structured data than in others. It's definitely an issue. It's something that, in my opinion, I've seen a huge change in the last 10 years in this space. I guess mainly because there's a big move to having data in the same format and the same coding structures. So there's an international expansion of coding structures like SNOMED and ICD-10, et cetera, have been pushed across the globe. And the ability to connect these systems together really does amplify that. When we look at these situations, I think importantly, a system like ours, we know where some of the limitations lie. We are not out there saying that we will find every patient with a rare disease. We would wish we would be able to do that. But really what we're doing is we're finding patients that have been missed. But the information is in fact coded into the structured data or in the data somewhere. So the early patients that we're starting to float out are these patients that actually, if you look at the structured data that is available, they have these signs and symptoms that should warrant some further investigation. So that's a very important piece of the journey. And I think as we go further and further, and we've seen this, there's just more and more data is becoming available. So hopefully, maybe now we're starting with 10%, but next year it might be 15%, and then hopefully it rockets from there.
Durhan.
Okay, I'm happy to pass it to somebody else if you want to. I just happen to be holding it. Now, fascinating, obviously, in terms of what you're doing, and certainly, I think, interested in terms of the scalability of it. But let me go in the opposite direction, because you've talked about the ability to find people that are not diagnosed. What about false positives, and what are you doing about that, and how does that affect in terms of, I know you're working with their primary care.
Sure. So technically, we're actually a clinical decision support system. So we float these patients to a clinician to review. And in fact, the idea of false positives is an interesting one because we play a fine balance. We're in a world where we can titrate the effectiveness to some degree of the algorithms that we're working. If we make them too tight, where we limit the false positives too much, we find very few patients across the diagnosed. Even when we do retrospective analysis, we will see very low numbers. So we play this game of how many false positives can we actually allow and still at the same time not overburden the healthcare setting, but keep the clinicians that are reviewing these things interested in and believing that the technology can work. And we think that this magic number is about 30% positives. So when we push these patients forward, when I say that, sorry, if we put 10 patients forward, we think that that the clinicians, after reviewing these patients, they are happy to put 35% of those patients forward. That seems to be the sweet spot for them. If it was 1 in 10, yes, great, but we would be finding too few patients. So it's always a bit of a titration balance.
Wonderful. And unfortunately, we are out of time. So thank you, Peter.
Thank you.